Um, hi everyone, thanks for joining. Welcome to the Data Economics Festival, hosted by the Data Economics Company. My name is Surtaj Brar, and we're about to kick off our session titled Defining, Tracking, and Verifying Smallholder Regenerative Agriculture. If you're joining for your first session, you can learn more by going to lydion.com/festival. That's lydion.com/festival, where you can find content related to 20+ panels where we've been hosting all week, as well as some fun happy hour style events like a virtual golf clinic and a live sing-along, both of which are coming up later today. For those of you who are watching the session live, I encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A button. I'll put a reminder in the chat as well. And with that, I'd like to introduce like to ask my friend Hugh Locke to introduce himself, and then he's going to be probably leading most of this session on, once again, on defining, tracking, and verifying smallholder regenerative agriculture. Hugh.
Thank you, Surtaj. So my name is Hugh Locke. I'm the co-founder and president of the Smallholder Farmers Alliance, which is a nonprofit working with smallholders in Haiti. And we are also in the process of developing a data app and platform involving the Lydion group, which is focused on tracking regenerative agricultural practices with smallholders starting in Haiti, but with potential for international application. So the whole question of regenerative is something that we are deeply involved in. And so before I do anything else, I'm going to call on Karen to introduce herself, please.
Thanks, Hugh. Hello, everyone. I'm Karen MAPUSUA. I'm speaking to you from Suva in Fiji in the South Pacific. I have a couple of hats. I work for an organization called the Pacific Community, which is a Pacific intergovernmental organization that provides science and technical support to our 22 countries and territories of the Pacific. And I manage the division that provides support in agriculture and forestry. I'm also the vice president of iFoam Organics International, and so also have a really strong interest in regenerative agriculture and how all the different sustainable agriculture movements can come together and support each other. I've worked in the Pacific for almost 20 years, originally from Australia. Nice to be with you all.
Thank you. Thank you for getting up so early. Tim, would you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Tim TENSEN. I'm a senior designer at Terragenesis International. We are a supply development company focused on developing regenerative agriculture around the globe. A lot of my work, especially over the past few years, has focused on smallholder data agricultural systems. I've been a part of developing systems for grazing, different agroforestry applications in North America, South and Central America, Southeast Asia, really focused on what we call outcome-based verification. So developing relationships directly with farmers and farmer cooperatives, and using data technologies to bridge the gaps and build relationships of trust between the farmers and farmer cooperatives and the brands that are sourcing from them. So I think this conversation is right up my alley, and super excited to be speaking with everyone here.
Thank you. And last, Roy, if you would introduce yourself, please.
Sure. My name is Roy STEINER. I lead the food initiative at the Rockefeller Foundation. We are really focused on food system transformation, in the sense that we all know that without addressing these fundamental questions like regenerative agriculture, we're just not meeting the needs of humanity right now, given that agriculture is, the food systems contribute to a third of greenhouse gases, and diet is now the #1 risk for early mortality. So we need a full-scale transformation across the entire food system if it's going to meet the needs of the future.
Thank you. Well, let me start by just kind of positioning the discussion and acknowledging, first of all, that it's Earth Day. And when Earth Day started in 1970, it was the result of a large groundswell of grassroots concern for environmental protection. And part of that translated into consumer concerns, and that eventually led to the emergence of organic standards. And those began, you would never be able to go into a regular supermarket and find anything organic. You had to go to usually a fairly funky location where things were, stacked and not packaged well. And I always found them a bit gray. But anyway, then it has become more mainstream. And we have the official organic standards in various countries. The United States is managed by USDA. But in a way, not everyone's going to agree with me, the whole process of responding to citizen and consumer concerns with regard to sourcing of products kind of got stopped at a certain point, and it could have gone further, but organic, by and large, in terms of the certification process, has come to be defined by the absence of bad stuff, to put it bluntly. But it didn't go further. There were attempts to supplement that by introducing fair trade, which then looked at a broader range of issues in connection with farm outputs. But in many ways, we're now coming full circle back to a more holistic view of farming and environmental practices. And that's where regenerative comes in. It's still very much in the process of emerging. And so this is the perfect time to be engaged in this, and we are all involved in one way or another. And so this is why it's so interesting to be able to talk about this today and just look at where it is, who's shaping it, how does it roll out over the next few years. I find that I encounter two primary groups of people with regard to regenerative. The ones who've never even heard the word. I was 2 days ago, I was on with a Zoom call with a group of 28 students, graduate students from Drew University in New Jersey, talking about our work in Haiti. And I raised the term regenerative. Nobody knew what that meant. I had to actually go to the very basics and just sort of start from scratch, Then on the other hand, you've got people involved in, for example, the fashion business, because our work involves a relationship between Smallholder Farmers Alliance and the Timberland Company. And Timberland is in turn owned by the VF Corporation, which owns a lot of major clothing and footwear brands. And they're all deeply engaged in addressing regenerative, although there is no single common definition of regenerative within that group, even though they talk about it a lot and are very involved in it. So that's sort of the spectrum right now, So it's an interesting time to be involved. Let me now just sort of, I want to pose a question. So bottom line, what is regenerative agriculture? And I'll just throw in one definition that I read the other day, yoga, but for farmland, which I thought was a good way to approach it. So Karen, given that you got up first of all of us, and it's still the middle of the night in Fiji, you get to have the first response on this. How would you define regenerative as it stands right now? And then maybe secondly, where would you like it to evolve to in terms of a definition, a working definition?
Okay, thanks, Hugh. Well, being a practicing yogini, I sort of like that definition. I think that works quite well. But I mean, really, I think when I think about regenerative, I think that it's about intent. So if I look at all the different types of sustainable agriculture, although I'm not a fan of the word sustainable agriculture out there, so regenerative, agroecology, organic in its original sense, not certified organic, really, there's not a huge amount of difference with them, but it is about intent. And regeneration is the intent is carbon sequestration and mitigation of climate impact, and that is the focus of that production system from where I see it. And others may have different intents. Agroecology has a very strong social component, for example. So yeah, to me, it's about intent. Where I'd like to see it going, I guess, I am concerned about getting into too strong a definitions, because that's where frankly we lost the plot with organics. When we moved to having to provide a guarantee to consumer, which I completely understand, we started to codify. But then once governments engaged and regulated it, that's when it became less about that connection between soil and plant and human health, and more about you cannot do this, you cannot do that, you cannot do something else. So we need to be very careful in that step towards how do we define and how do we say what it is and how do we avoid greenwashing, and getting trapped into defining it by what you are not allowed to do, which is what happens with organic agriculture.
Yeah. I'm reminded of applying for a European Union grant. And this was only the first phase of the concept note application. And they sent a very large document of all the guidelines required for that application. And I recall that there were, I believe, 6 pages on the definition of force majeure. And I thought, only a bureaucracy of that kind would try to define God's intervention in climate. But anyway, Tim, you've talked about regenerative in terms of not wanting to define it precisely, but looking at it in terms of levels of engagement. Could you answer this double question? How do you define or not define regenerative, and where do you want to see that definition evolving to?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's whenever I'm engaging with clients or partners, that's always one of the first questions I ask, because I think everyone does, and I typically phrase it as, what's your relationship with regenerative agriculture? Because what I find is that each of us has a different relationship with it, and that I think is part of the beauty of the idea of regenerative agriculture, and I think in line with the organic and sustainable and even biodynamic movements before that. I think Rodale was maybe the first person to actually write down the term regenerative agriculture in the 80s. And, I think there's been a lot of different streams of thought from, holistic management coming out of Alan Savory's work, and permaculture from the Bill Mollison and the Australian movement, the regenerative paradigm that I think has been really strongly advocated for by Carol Sanford in business, and Ethan Soloviev and Gregory Landway, and Rodale Organic. I think there's just been a lot of effort to really bring integrity to agriculture, and I think when I think about the definition for regenerative agriculture, I think that I agree in a large way with Karen that the intent is really important, and I think we can oftentimes become divided when we start to overly define something, and we lose sight of the shared mission. And with that being said, I think there are certain components that when you look at it, aside from the definition, that humans have been practicing since we've moved from more of a pastoral way of life to more of an agrarian and agricultural way of life. I think when in our work, when we use the term, there are kind of different levels of engagement as we see it, and I think those aren't mutually exclusive, but more nested within one another, right? Where I think kind of at the beginning, you're just trying to do things like integrated pest management and kind of that do less harm mentality, where you're trying to use less chemical fertilizers and rely on things like composting and manure applications and cover cropping. But I think as you do move up, I do think agroecology is kind of the aspiration for regenerative agriculture. I do believe that for us to be successful, that we need to understand the provenance, the terroir of a region, and how that creates certain cultures and rituals around production. And I think to equate, wheat or other types of commodities across the board as being all the same no matter where they're produced, I think is a disservice to the communities that are producing them, that are working towards that kind of production for our global food supply, for our apparel, as you mentioned, Hugh, and for our other products that rely on our agricultural systems. So I do think that there are probably a lot of practices that we could agree fall under the umbrella of regenerative, such as soil building practices or carbon sequestration. But then I think there's kind of a broader set that really depends on the region. And I think in our work, the reason why the intent is important, but the outcome is even more important, because we need to actually be in a co-evolutionary relationship with the places where we're producing food, which I think means that we're going to do it wrong sometimes, and we're going to fall short of our aspirations. And I think the way that organic has been managed leads to more punitive measures than are really necessary. I think when we look at the aspiration of regenerative agriculture, it's in supporting producers through our supply systems to continually improve the place where they're producing food. And so when I think about regenerative agriculture, for me, the spirit of it is really a food system that works with producers to improve the places where they're producing their food, to support their relationship with their land, as much as it's supporting the consumers with the clothes that they're wearing, the food that they're consuming to bring them health. And I think those are the kinds of metrics that we should be looking for when we're trying to understand and evaluate the efficacy of our regenerative agricultural systems.
Thank you. Roy, you're sort of at the crossroads of many different aspects of food systems, and maybe in a unique position to be able to interact with the broadest range of people involved in food production of all of us. So how do you define or not define regenerative, and where do you see that process evolving to?
Thanks, Hugh. Yeah, so I would really agree with a lot of what Tim and Karen have laid out. And our experience, we have a recent experience with an initiative we called the Food System Vision Prize. And the idea was, how do we get local food systems, communities, organizations to think about the food system they actually wanted? And we had over 1,300 submissions to that Vision Prize. And what was really interesting is the vast majority talked about a regenerative agriculture, right? I mean, I think there's people who are engaged in the food system recognize that we are farming in a way that degrades the environment, it degrades the community, it's degrading and destroying what we know is important. And so unless we can reverse that, and that's why regeneration, it's not, and I agree with Karen, sustainability, it's just no, that's just not good enough. We have to regenerate the vast majority of farming systems in the world, which are not delivering the environmental, social, economic benefits that we need. That being said, I do think, I think intent is critical. We do need ways to measure it, right? And I think that's our struggle. But measures that are really applicable to the incredible diversity in the context. The top 10 visionaries ranged from the 7th gen Rosebud Indian Reservation, which is really an agricultural system centered around the buffalo, right? And to Mama's Kitchen in China, which is all about, we need to completely move towards a plant-forward diet, and or to the Dutch system, which was this high-tech circular food system that really leveraged latest AI and automation to regenerate the soil. So each context is so different, but we still need ways to measure progress. And I do think, there probably are some, like, so I think the idea around soil carbon is potentially one. Biodiversity is the other, some of the circular economy measures that people are proposing. But we're going to need something that can be applied to work across many contexts that showed moving in the right direction. But I am curious what other people think about that.
Well, if we go back to the emergence of industrial agriculture, which really took hold in, let's say, the early 1960s. And up to that point, you could have described most agriculture as being roughly in the category of agroecology, but it didn't have that term. Then the term, as I understand it, kind of came into being as industrial scale agriculture took off with a huge force. And people then were trying to describe what it was replacing. And that became agroecology. But it emerged as more of a practice rather than a designation of a particular system. And I'm wondering, is regenerative going to become a movement? Is it a movement with measurable outcomes? Is it something that has a broad application? So, for example, representatives of Rodale and Monsanto are in a room talking about regenerative. What does that discussion sound like? And Karen, if you were in the room moderating that discussion, where would you start? Would you make the Monsanto people leave the room?
Probably. So, yeah, I mean, that's a really difficult conversation. And I think finding the middle of the ground between two extremes is always the hardest thing. But again, if we can find those points of coming together somehow between those groups, that's the starting point. I think the thing with the agroecological approach is humans are integral to it. And that is something that evolved out as we moved into the industrial agriculture age. So bringing humans back to the center of that, I think, is an important part of that conversation. And something that we do need to talk about with the Monsantos and Sygentas of the world, that there has to be a human-centered approach to all of our development. We're not separate from the planet and the ecological and agricultural systems that we work with. So I'd probably be trying to frame the conversation in that way and seeing where the two could come together, where they could learn from each other. And I think that's an important thing about all these different camps that we have in the agriculture world, is that we can be learning from each other rather than drawing the barriers between us. So there will be practices in regenerative systems, there will be practices in agroecology that conventional farmers will benefit from and will start to adopt because they will need to, because we all need to build resilience for climate change. So I think it's finding those places where we can say, let's learn from each other, rather than just look at the differences, will be the start of that very complex conversation.
And if you were, I'll ask this question to Tim. If someone said to you, where is regenerative currently being practiced and how do you acknowledge it? So for example, I know that not too far from me is Stone Barns, and you guys have helped them map out a regenerative strategy. But where is it being practiced? Where is regenerative being practiced? And how do you know it's being practiced?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. Sometimes it's easy to flip things on their head and look from the other direction. And one thing that I'll put out there, and some folks may disagree with this, but I don't know that we've ever really had regenerative agriculture in the United States since the start of colonization. I think that when you look at the spread of colonial powers, I think you had a pretty consistent degradation and an intent to extract for a centralized authority. And I think that we really have to take a really deeply historical view to understand why we use land the way that we do. And I think when you look at the history of Massachusetts, for example, from day one, it was a part of the triangular trade between the UK, the Caribbean, and trading dried meats and rye. Wheat did not grow well in the Connecticut River Valley, but it was kind of the breadbasket for the New England region. The Connecticut River Valley was. And I think that it really was integral to the slave trade, to the production in the Caribbean that was feeding a lot of the industry in the UK and supporting the Industrial Revolution in Europe, beginning in the United Kingdom. And I think that when you look at where that was sourced from, a lot of those kind of colonial practices were borrowed from the Roman civilization, right? The latifundia systems that were really, again, privileged on this process of extracting resources from the colonies and bringing it towards a central region. And I think we're still doing that. And I think until we acknowledge that and at least talk about the roots of the methods that we use to grow the various, food, fiber, and other materials that we need and transport them, I don't think we'll be able to have systems that truly actually feel and are experienced by all participants as regenerative. And the reason I bring that up is that I think a lot of the kind of examples of regenerative agriculture, I think, are represented by indigenous peoples or those who have resisted colonization to various degrees of success. I think they are the people that we often look to for those forms of agriculture that have been preserved through time, that have been tested in those regions. I think when you look at the chestnut forests in the Greek states or in France, or even in northern Italy at some of the agricultural systems there that have kind of resisted simplification for extraction. When you look outside of Europe, I think there are numerous examples across the world. In Southeast Asia, we're working with some amazing rubber farmers that have this food sovereignty movement. And I think those types of movements, to me, I think you can't extricate the social from the environmental. I think it's a mistake to try and do that because we live in a system that has been designed to extract resources. And I think regenerative at its core is about replenishment, about a reciprocity with the environment. And I think that we, as Karen was saying, we're a part of that environment. And I think we have to be talking about that.
Still, the challenge becomes acknowledging that it's not easy. This is a difficult question, but how do you measure? So for example, rather than saying something is going to have the equivalent of a regenerative label, mm-hmm. which we all realize would in and of itself probably be the death knell of regenerative. So in the absence of that, as Roy was mentioning, is it, for example, coming up with a way to measure, and you touched on this too, Tim, some of the outcomes. So can regenerative ultimately be defined on a sliding scale of moving towards regenerative or away from it based on agreed upon measurements of soil carbon, of biodiversity? Could there be an index of things that then you get a kind of a score coming out of that? Or is that in and of itself too arbitrary? Karen.
Yeah, you could. And again, that would have to be very site specific. If I think about the Pacific Islands, some of our atolls have such a narrow biodiversity base to start off with. The parameters for our situation would need to be entirely different from what you measured in a continental place. And I guess the other question, and this is something that we get feedback from farmers in the Pacific region, where we come and talk about organic and talk about regenerative or talk about agroecology, and they're saying, well, why am I suddenly having to be measured for what I've been practicing for a long time and we know is sustainable and we know works? And, you know, why do I have to measure it? Why do I have to prove that what I've been doing for generations works for you? And I think this is something we also need to think about as well. I mean, there are many traditional Indigenous systems that are at their core regenerative. Do we need to engage with them in that way in order to meet some idea that everything has to be measured, which doesn't always apply in every context?
Yeah.
Roy, you're so much in the middle of this discourse. What's your take on that?
I agree that some things are, you know, a lot of times it's very difficult to measure. But I wanted to kind of go back to a couple of previous points, and I'll get back to the measurement part. It's interesting, Tim. I think I agree with you that we have to understand the historical context. That we created these systems to be highly extractive, and therefore, Hugh, I don't think that everything before the industrial agriculture of the 60s was agroecological. We actually had a lot of extractive, destructive agricultural systems throughout the world for hundreds of years, and actually thousands of years. I mean, if you look at civilizations, a lot of civilizations collapsed because they created completely unsustainable, non-regenerative.
Well, and the whole Sahara being initially a breadbasket for the Roman Empire, and what that left behind by way of, I know.
Exactly. So, and we've had or quote unquote organic systems that completely destroyed the environment, right? So it goes back to this: what's the intent? What do we know? How can we know that we're moving forward? You know, it's interesting. One of my first 25 years ago or 30 years ago, I actually was a fellow at the Rockefeller Foundation, and my task was to define sustainable agriculture. And I ended up saying, well, where do we have long-term field experiments around the world, and ones that were more than 25 years, and what does that tell us about sustainability? And I actually collected, people thought there were 50 or 60 of them. There are actually about 300 of these long-term field experiments. But what turned out to be so challenging is that over time, so much changes, right? The social dynamic, the economic, the physical, the climate, all of that's dynamic and changing. And although I do think you can kind of come up with sets of measures, and I think there's some people out there who've tried to do that quite effectively in many for many situations, not all. At the end of the day, I think sustainability, regenerative, is kind of like love and justice. They're incredibly important, but very context specific, but absolutely essential to have a conversation around. You can't just say, oh, I can't define love, I can't define justice, so let's just forget about it. No, those are absolutely critical to being, to living. And I think kind of the concept of regeneration is a conversation we all need to have for context specifics. I do think that there are probably some types of measures that work for 80% of the agricultural systems out there. And we still have to kind of explore that, because we still need to know whether we're moving forward. But I also really resonate with this, 3 of the top 10 visionary winners in our Vision Prize were actually Indigenous groups, because fundamentally they're system thinkers from the very beginning. Like they didn't even have to do anything. They just described what they were doing, and they won because they had such a clear understanding of what it meant to create a system. So I can understand, like, why do people who've been doing things right have to prove that they're measuring? But maybe so that we could learn from them. I don't know.
Well, I think that's, I just want to add there, because I really appreciate what both Karen and Roy have said. I think we really have to ask the question, and every time that I engage in a project that's focused on data collection, the number one question is who's collecting the data, and then I think the next question is why, right? And I think a lot of the data collection right now is driven by carbon markets, which can create some really perverse incentives. And I think, you know, Roy, I appreciate you saying that it has to be a conversation, and I fully agree that you know, and I've had the same reaction from farmers that say, what we've been doing, why do we have to now quantify what we've been doing? Like, the evidence is here. And I think that that's where the relationship begins, because then you can take a brand or someone who's an off-taker, right? Are they a carbon off-taker, a materials off-taker, a produce off-taker? And that's where you build the relationship, which is like, we would like, here are our reasons for investing in your system. And here are your reasons. And I think that's a conversation that needs to happen, because otherwise it does perpetuate a type of a data extraction. And I think it, you know, on top of the material or the resource extraction, there becomes a data extraction. Oh, we need this to prove our carbon to our consumers, or we need this to prove to our consumers so they feel less guilty about buying our products, and they'll spend the premium for this, you know, whatever it is. And I think we do need to be guarded against that and hold the integrity.
One of the things we're in the midst of with our data project, which is both an app and a platform that we're developing in partnership with Lydion, full disclosure. But it started off by wanting to figure out how to get data from smallholder farmers that could then be used by Timberland for, you know, being able to, specifically in the case of cotton, talk about cotton as being both organic and regenerative. But rather than going for third-party certification, which that was the first thing we decided, that we couldn't do that. First of all, it's just too expensive, but it also just puts you into this category, you know, and it oversimplifies things, and you start to try and make sure everything gets shoved into those categories for that third-party certification. So we decided that we would go for gathering data from smallholder farmers that was in a way generic, and being able to provide as much data as we could, and then asking Timberland to pay the farmers directly for the data. So it's not simply extracting the data and then it doesn't mean anything to the farmers, but making it a farm product. And then saying to Timberland, you have to figure out what you want to do with the data as a kind of brand position. How are you engaging around these issues? How are you using this data? And that's where we are right now. And we're doing a pilot starting this summer, focused on using the app to track both cotton. So we're planting in July for a harvest which will come in January with approximately 60 smallholder farmers. At the same time, we're using the app to track tree planting by smallholder farmers and looking at what that could potentially represent by way of carbon sequestration. But thinking of the data as, I mean, we're taking all the data points we could find on both organic and regenerative, incorporating that into the app, but not trying to say that we've determined what the outcome should be. Rather, we're just pulling it all in and then thinking, okay, at some point, if we just make available the data in a kind of radical transparency mode, eventually it'll get figured out, rather than trying to start with a definition and try and make everything fit to that. But Karen, to your point earlier about, you know, why should smallholder farmers even care about validating what they've been doing all along? Is it reasonable to assume that if that data had a value to them in terms of direct payment for the data, is that enough of a validation? What do you think?
In some contexts, I think it would be, but I think that many of the farmers I work with would find much more value in sharing their data if it empowered them in some way. If they were then supported to use that data to make decisions, to understand what was going on, then I think it has real value for the farmers and you get more engagement and more buy-in. I'm working with a group of farmers at the moment who came to us and said, and then they're the growers of our big commercial crops in the Pacific, which in relative terms are not very big, but for us, they're commercially important and they're also the ones that do the most environmental damage. And they came and said, we want to improve our systems. We don't know how, we need to understand, we need to make an evidence-based decision about changing our production practices. So to be able to gather data and support those farmers in their decision-making, really, really valuable. Those farmers would probably also be interested in selling their data. But yeah, I guess get a little bit nervous about everything having that dollar value. I think the empowerment of smallholders and improving agency and their ability to make those evidence-based decisions for their own lives and their own farms and their own families is really the most critical thing.
One of the dimensions of this app is very specifically, how does that data help a smallholder farmer? In our experience in Haiti, most smallholder farmers could not tell you what their input costs were, their net profit, any of that kind of information. So part of what we want to do is make that base level data available to the farmers in a way that assists them. We're also incorporating weather data into the app so that it will be provided free of charge to help farmers make informed decisions about planting times, to the degree possible. All of this balanced against low levels of literacy. So how much of it can be pictorial, but then it gets down to the relationship between the Smallholder Farmers Alliance, our organization's agronomists, and the farmers, because the agronomists are the ones that are going to be gathering the data, and then they're the ones who are going to be sharing it back with the smallholder farmers. And then trying to figure out what's the role of farm leaders in a given community in terms of how that data gets used and sold. So that do we need to think about a kind of guardianship role for data in connection with smallholder farmers so it's not abused? Or I don't know. Tim, how have you seen this working because you've worked a lot with smallholders and data. What's your take on that?
I think it can be really empowering. I remember the first time showing some smallholders aerial imagery from a drone, just to see the tops of the trees that they were growing, and to actually see like, oh, wow, I've never seen the farm from this perspective. And to really understand, in that case, we were using geospatial information and environmental analysis to look at disease pressures and distribution across a farm, and being able to say, oh, I saw these diseases on these trees, and we could actually look and say, oh, based on elevation and topographic data and some other environmental variables, we can see that if you were to strategically intercrop here, you would actually alleviate those kind of disease concerns, those disease vectors, because a lot of the trees that are spreading the diseases are those that are in low-lying areas that are seasonally inundated, right? And so I think there were really clear ways of improving the systems. And in my experience in Ecuador and Southeast Asia, a lot of these producers are really excited about, they don't see their relationships as being static or as if they've figured it out. It really is a relationship, something that requires constant attention, and having information that can help them understand their farm from new perspectives, I think is really exciting. And that goes from everything from tracking wildlife and being able to idea, even in some cases, it's academic partnerships. I think academic partnerships are a really tremendous way for farmers. It doesn't have to just be our, a private company's data systems. It can be private companies' data systems feeding into academic research that helps identify movement of local pollinators or mammals or other types of wildlife that are able to then be supported in those environments. Yeah.
That reminds me of, there's a new initiative that was just announced in January called the Regenerative Fund for Nature. And I don't know if you've heard of this. This was put together by the Caring Group, which owns Gucci, Saint Laurent, a bunch of other fashion things.
The New York Times article on it.
Yeah, in partnership with Conservation International. So they're putting this fund together to be able to offer small grants to smallholder farmers and others involved at a community level in moving towards regenerative and helping to cover the costs while they're in transition, but then does that build a dependency? Is that, Roy, how would you look at that in terms of a balanced perspective?
I think we need to help smallholder farmers move transition. But I actually had a question for you and the others. Well, I mean, Rodale's come up with this regenerative organic label, right? And Patagonia Provisions has adopted it, etc. I'm curious what you think about that, and because I know you had a adverse reaction to labeling, but I'm curious, when does it work and when does it not? And Karen, Tim, feel free to jump in there.
Tim, why don't you take a stab at that?
Yeah, so Roy, you're wondering about the kind of the utility of a definition is in general.
Well, a label.
Yeah, so Rodale now has issued that they have standards, and they're trying to get a group of get people to be able to do third-party verification that this is a regenerative organic system, and it has a whole sets of things that they have laid out in order for you to be able to get the organic or regenerative organic label, right? Which is what they claim is one step above organic, right? It includes the soil and the social dimensions.
Yeah, I really want to believe in labels. I really do, but I don't particularly. I think that in theory, it's kind of like any kind of form of governance. In theory, in a perfect world, it's great. And then it, as soon as it hits the ground, all of a sudden there's all of the eventualities that conspire to influence it in different ways. And I think there's really no comparison with transparency and relationships. And I don't think relationships are something like a certification that you can do once a year and walk away. I think relationships require more energy, more investment than that. And I think that they also require a lot more humility. And I think that, the versioning, for example, that ROC and the Regenerative Organic Alliance are doing is great. I think that shows a commitment to constant updating and improvement of those systems. The challenge that I see is that we need humility when we approach these systems because we don't fully understand. Even the science around soil organic carbon sequestration is a little iffy. I think there's a lot of contention there, and I'm really scared of hitching the whole regenerative movement to soil organic carbon. I just don't think we know enough yet, and I think it holds a lot of potential, but the science isn't conclusive about what we can do. And I really do believe that the most important thing we can do is to build relationships with the producers who are committing to a given farm landscape and working with them in a transparent fashion. And I think data technologies make that possible. I think blockchain makes that possible. The work that a lot of companies now like Regen Network are doing to create full transparency, data accessibility, I think is the future. I think the ability, like you're talking about, Hugh, for direct payments to producers so that a consumer can buy a a food product or an apparel product and be able to see the percentage that went to the producer. I think that level of transparency is what the kind of data technologies that we have today make possible. And I think certifications may have been necessary in the past, but I think they were an imperfect solution, and maybe data technologies are as well, but I think it's an advancement.
One of the questions that's come in the chat section was how can people, and I'm translating this to consumers included in that, support smallholder farmers remaining both sustainable and profitable? And then that raises the question about, for example, the label. How expensive is it for smallholders to maintain the standards required by a formal label and all the things that come with that? And then, how does that balance out in terms of their increased costs, be able to meet that and still, be profitable and sustainable? Karen, what's...
Yeah, the cost of certification is a really big limitation on a lot of smallholders, and in the end it comes down to scale. If you've got a grower group of 4,000, it becomes more cost effective per farmer than if you have a grower group of 20 achieving certification. Mm-hmm. It's difficult to get around that at the moment until we can move into that sort of technology that Tim was talking about for the longer value chains. I can go to the market and buy coffee from a farmer I know, but I know that in Massachusetts, Tim can't do that. It's got to be imported from somewhere else. So he needs a level of verification that's very different to the level of verification I need. Mm-hmm. So I think it's something we have to continue working on, and I really am interested in how these new technologies might be able to assist that. I don't know that certification will ever entirely go away. It might just take a different form, and we might be measuring some other things with it as well, and using those new tools that could potentially help reduce some of those costs. I think there's going to be a suite of solutions. We are using very much in the Pacific and in a lot of places the participatory guarantee systems, where farmers undertake peer review of farmers within their group in order to provide a guarantee to market. That works very, very well in some circumstances. For us, it works, it gels very well with the cultural imperative. So it's a very, very strong system. Might not work in other places. So I don't think there's one answer. I think we've got to look at all those different options, relationships being at the center of it, and having consumers take responsibility for their choices is at the other end as well, for consumers to be educated and understand what they're buying, where they're buying from, what their labels mean or don't mean.
So a last question for each of you. Where do you think regenerative could be, or where you would like it to be in 10 years? And you're describing to someone what happened between Earth Day 2021 and that period 10 years later. Tim, I'll put you on the spot first.
Yeah, well, I think particularly in a temperate context, trees take a while. I heard of a farmer that I was visiting a couple of weeks ago say that you plant fruit trees for your children and chestnuts for your grandchildren, right? And I think that where I would like it to be is not realistic. And I similarly a quote that I'll often use is that you can't increase or accelerate the development of an old growth forest, right? An old growth forest is defined by the deep co-evolutionary relationships that have filled all of the niches and are recycling those nutrients. And I think in 5 to 10 years, I would love to see us in a transitional state where farmers across the world are being supported, not just by consumers. I think there's a misconception that consumers' buying practices is the kind of a measure that will solve it. I think it's brands. I think brands need to take responsibility to do business differently. And I think what I'd like to see is that more participation across the supply system, not just consumers changing their minds, not just farmers being forced to change based on consumer decisions, but that there's really kind of a partnership. And in 5 to 10 years, I would love to see that sort of transparency and partnership across the supply system, and the movement towards more perennialized forms of production, more research being done. I would love to see a lot more research on these practices. So, because we don't actually know, there's a lot of hand waving, and I think we just need to know what's actually working towards our goals. And so I would, in 5 to 10 years, I would love to see that more research, more farmers being supported across the supply system, and more transparency.
So Roy, if you were reporting in 10 years on a 10-year Rockefeller-funded research initiative into regenerative, what would you like to be reporting at that point?
Well, I actually would love to see, kind of doubling down on what Tim said, that regenerative becomes the conversation that everybody in food systems has to have. And in particular, we have research programs. You go to the USDA, they will have an entire regenerative research that is context specific. So I would love to be able to say, in different food system contexts, there's been a rigorous community and scientific conversation around what regenerative is, what people want around the future, and then some really good scientific experiments and knowledge generation and learning processes in place that are relevant to that particular location. And everybody agrees that if we're doing these things, actually the environment is getting better, the community is getting better, the economic is getting better. That could, if we could point to thousands of food systems around the world that are having that conversation, and billions of dollars of research going into regenerative and agroecological and other types of research, I think we get a thumbs up.
Thank you. Karen?
Yeah, I'm a big one on the research dollar as well. If you look at the figures now on the amount of agricultural research funding that goes into regenerative, organic, agroecology, it is just a couple of % of the total budgets. So that needs to be a fundamental shift in the next 10 years. I think the other thing that I'd really like to see is we've got to keep removing those barriers. We talk in the organic movement now of organic 3.0, and it's about taking the practices into the mainstream. So while we want to see more organic farmers or certified organic farmers, we want to see more other farmers adopting those really positive practices. And it's the same with regenerative. There'll be a group of farmers that will be labeled or defined as regenerative, but the big change is when those who are not calling themselves regenerative farmers are starting to adopt those practices just because they're good practices and it improves their farming. And I think that's the next 10 years. It's that shifting that whole curve forward towards a more regenerative production and food system, but not just by so-called regenerative farmers or organic farmers.
I love this conversation. I just want to continue, but I know we can't do this forever. But one of the things that we've been...
also just add that there are some questions from the audience as well, when we have a few, if you'd like.
Before I get to those, let me just say, we have been having a discussion within our smaller group, the Smallholder Farmers Alliance and Lydion group, and the partners that we're bringing in, including TerraGenesis. The potential value of putting together a paper that could be signed on by a very wide cross section from fashion to food systems to research bodies to whatever, to try and basically say, here's some of the things we should take into consideration as regenerative moves forward. And just the things that we've been touching on in this conversation, to me, are core to that kind of setting out of broad terms for people to think about with regard to regenerative over the course of the next 10 years. So we may be getting back to each of you to sort of say, what could that look like? In terms of questions, Roy has to jump off, which we
yeah, let me start. I can read them out. There was one from Megan Walsh asking, are there examples in media where lay people can grasp the idea? Example, the Biggest Little Farm or other documentaries. I just want to read this out as well. I know there's a couple of answers in the chat. I want to read out so for people who don't have can't see the Q&A. But Karen, Kiss the Ground is great, and Tim mentioned a film called Gather. And Hugh, I don't know if you had anything as well.
No, not specifically.
Okay. Do you want to take one of the other questions if you're looking at them?
Well, one of them we touched on was that how can people support smallholder farmers remaining sustainable and profitable? And I mean, I think at one level, it's looking out for brands that are engaged in this in a thoughtful way and that are trying to say, we're in the process of figuring it out. We're not there yet, because we got to be honest, nobody's there yet. But here's what we're doing systematically to try and improve it. And you know, that's one way to support either the brands or the groups that are working with the brands in that kind of dynamic. Then another question is, many of the answers around what is regenerative also center on community. I think Karen said something like human focused. And if we talk about replenishment or restoration, would regenerative practices also have to include measures of the health of the community? Very important. Tim, because you're in the middle of this. And
yeah, I love that.
Basis.
That's such an important question. I think it's for the community to decide. You know, I think experts assisted, community decided is maybe a way to think about it. You know, in our work, you know, we're looking at things like spiritual well-being. You know, are there spiritual practices, you know, in some of the communities that they may be Buddhist or practicing Muslims or may have some other sort of faith practice that is deeply intertwined with the production systems. And so I think it's about finding out how are they supported in that. And I think it's looking at access to healthcare. I think the interest of the youth. I mean, I think the average age of the farmer globally is around 60, and you know, and I think globally we're seeing a movement of youth to urban areas. And I think is there available livelihoods? And I think these are questions that I think, you know, Karen, you mentioned the PGS. I think that's so important, and that's the foundation of a lot of our data systems. Is fundamentally train the trainer. Is passing the knowledge not through, you know, the white American expert coming in and telling you how to do this, but creating a community that holds that knowledge themselves and is able to pass that along. And so I think those are the types of indicators that need to be supported from within the community rather than facilitated from outside. And so I think that, you know, a big part of it is we can come up with the indicators, but then work with the communities to figure out what does progress look like in those communities.
One of the things that we've been exploring with the we call it the Smallholder Data Services app is what are the indicators that are reliable enough to be able to measure something, for example, the role of women participating in a farm household. And how do you measure that? And it turns out that there are internationally agreed upon informal indicators that can be tracked during the course of a visit to a farm household and getting information, so that you can then correlate things like changes in household income or yields or other aspects, and you know, the potential correlation between that and the improvement of women's access to resources when husband and wife are farming together. And to me, that becomes part of a very interesting, you know, dynamic. As you said, Tim, it has to also then, you have to factor in how does that translate to the local, that farm and that family, and what do they want? Because it can't simply be imposed. But Karen, your thoughts on this, if I can put you on the spot.
Yeah. Yeah, I think gender in agriculture is really important. It's a really critical factor, I think, everywhere in the world. Women's role in agriculture is severely underestimated. Yeah, and there's a lot of assumptions about women's work in the agriculture. To be community owned, it does have to be understood. It's a very, very cultural. That said, it is such an important issue. Education of children, everything links through to women's equality and women's empowerment. So we need to find the ways to work with communities and for communities to have these discussions themselves around what works, what doesn't work, what could be improved, and how would improving the condition of women help improve the whole community. And I think it's, it can't come from outside. It does have to come from inside. But every community I've worked with it's a conversation that people are willing to have and want to engage in, and it will. And the answers and solutions might be different, but not something we should be shying away from. It's a really critical part of improving agriculture.
Here's one question which maybe we can end on that has come through. As consumers, how can we be more aware of whether the products we are buying have been produced in a regenerative manner? Well, that gets straight to the debate, doesn't it? Probably not a label, or if it is, it's going to be a brand specific label with disclosure.
I think, Hugh, that there's a variety of things there, and sometimes it will be a label because there are labels out there, but you need to understand what those labels mean as a consumer. And the other thing is, wherever you can, get to know your local producer. Not everything is flown from across the world. A lot of food is going to be produced within a 100-kilometer radius, sorry, 100-mile radius. We're in North America mostly. So get to know those producers, find out about their production practices, join a CSA. There's a lot of things that you can do as a consumer to support your local farmers, encourage them towards better practices. And then, for the long value chains at the moment, it is the label.
Tim, your thoughts on that as a final?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, with the long value chain, it's really difficult. But I think similar to, it's easier to conserve soils than it is to rebuild them. And I think the same is true for materials that are in circulation. So I think, from an apparel perspective, supporting brands that are recycling, supporting any brand that's invested in the recirculation of materials or goods, I think is critical. I think we're losing a lot of forest and primary forest in particular to agricultural uses, and I think this is driven in large part by our consumption practices. So I think, I would just echo a lot of what Karen said about buying locally, and also when you travel, go meet with producers. Farmers generally sometimes are swamped with visitors if they're well known, but otherwise they love to talk about what they do. And I think that can be a really great way to learn about the kinds of practices or crops that are typical for that region, and potentially give you some access to an understanding of how to buy more direct. So
when we reconvene on Earth Day 2031, and we look back on the last 10 years, my personal hope is that we will be able to talk about regenerative as a movement that began to engage the broadest possible range of humans in a discussion about environmental responsibility, and it never got distilled into a single label, but it remained a dynamic conversation that changed every year as more and more people got involved, more and more systems were incorporated into the discussion, and that it remains this dynamic, evolving thing that represents the broadest potential participation from all levels, from farmers through to consumers. So on standby, mark your calendars, Earth Day 2031.
We'll be there.
Okay. Sertaj, thank you for convening us.
Thank you so much. Thank you for everyone. You know, this is honestly, it's been my favorite panel so far. I really have to say, it's one of the most interesting topics for me. So this has really been. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
So and we will continue to stay in touch, because this is an ongoing conversation that we're going to add more people to. But thank you guys very much.
Great.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.